forgotten what it means to have fun? Does fun seem like such a far fetched concept that you wouldn't even know where to start? Today's episode will help you remember what it means to have fun and why, by prioritizing fun, you can cultivate a life not only filled with joy, but also one with minimal regrets. Today, we're going to dive into the science of fun with the author of The Fun Habit itself, Dr. Mike Rucker. Be sure to stick around to the end for a light-hearted alternative to more rigorous self-improvement routines and a great way to build enjoyable habits that last. Let's dive in.
We all grew up watching fairy tales featuring Prince Charming, but not everyone gets the happy ever after they had in their dreams. So what are you supposed to do when your fairy tale ends? When everything you thought you knew falls apart? Welcome to Happily Ever After, What Now? I'm Kiri Honey, a confident communication coach for women, sharing my own experience after infidelity to help women learn to forgive and find their way forward to a life and relationship they love.
Today, we welcome Mike Rucker, the author of The Fun Habit. Mike, can you tell us where we can find you if we want to learn more about you?
Sure, of course. I write about the science of fun at my website, michaelrucker.com, and I had a book come out last year called The Fun Habit. And so, yeah, either through the book, which like now I'm admitting to people is fairly academic. So I think, it's funny if folks don't want to go a deep dive into all the science. Michael Rucker has all of the articles I write for trade media. So start there if you don't, if you're not ready for a science lesson. If you do really want to dig into what fun means and kind of the differences between joy and happiness, I recommend the book, of course, but I'm biased.
Well, I recommend the book as well. And it's so great to have you for a chat today. I want to jump straight in. So, why did you write a book about fun? And tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey and all that stuff.
Yeah, so I'm a charter member of the International Positive Psychology Association. And the reason I generally bring that up at the beginning is for folks that don't know what positive psychology is. And so it's a fairly new idea. It was started, the ideas behind it aren't new, but the idea of positive psychology as a discipline came about at the beginning of the millennium. A host of different clinicians and practitioners realized there were tools like mindfulness and gratitude and things of that nature that could be used for betterment, but that up until that point, primarily psychology had really just looked at clinical deficits, right? Essentially treating mental health rather than using these tools so that folks could better themselves. And positive psychology was born. And because it was a fairly new discipline, we were primarily focused on this idea of happiness because we hadn't talked about happiness en masse before. But what happened was, as we continued to do that and got folks, especially here in the West, because happiness with regards to individualistic cultures is a little bit different than happiness in collectivist cultures. And that's a whole nother science lesson. We don't need to get into it. But what is important is as we got North Americans and other countries in the West focus on, am I happy and how do I compare with regards to other countries like the World Happiness Index and things like that, we got people to really ruminate on this idea. And happiness is already a self-concept, right? Like, am I happy? Even just the proxy of that question gives you clues. And what happened as folks were ruminating on, am I a happy person? We were actually creating some of the most unhappy people out there. And, a lot of these tools, again, are helpful, but the way they were being presented became problematic. And they became problematic for me as well, personally. As I over-optimized my life for happiness, things were actually straightforward, were working until they weren't. In 2016, my younger brother suddenly passed away. I got an injury. I'd been a lifelong runner and found out I couldn't run again. And yet here I was, pretty Pollyanna and full of optimism. I'm like, I can just will my way out of this malaise. And like so many other folks, that I no bad days essentially kicked me on my butt. And so I wanted to figure out why. And that's really the short version of the beginning of the fun habit is happiness isn't something that we shouldn't aspire to or not want our friends and family to enjoy, but why as a construct leading people towards it as an end goal, why was that problematic? And so the idea about fun is really that it is this action orientation that we can do at any given moment. It is the ingredients for a joyful life because even if we're having a terrible day, generally, there are going to be times if we have a biological predisposition or something that's just so heavy we need to unpack it in the moment. We're going to want to grieve. If we don't do that, we'll lose emotional flexibility. But for most of the slings and arrows of life, like if we're like, you know what, I just want to go enjoy myself, we have that ability, yet we forget. And we know that gets pervasive, especially in adulthood. I mean, it's not only that we forget to do it in the moment, we forget to do it ever. And so what we're finding is that folks are living these fun starved lives and yet don't understand why is it that I'm just always feel not great. And the best part about it, what I unpack in the book, is that it doesn't take a lot to change that circumstance. It's really this reminder that, yes, we don't have control over everything, but we do have more agency and autonomy to put things into our schedule than we give ourselves credit. And when we take back that control, even when there are things, unfortunately, the last couple of weeks, more so than ever, that we don't have control over the outcome, we do have control what we can do with our time. And when we're able to do that, it might not change our circumstance overnight, but indexing these joyful memories, one, in those moments, we can't be sad, right? Because we're enjoying our time. But when we build this tapestry of things by our own design, we're reminded that, wait a second, we do have some control of how we experience this life, even if horrible things are happening around us.
Yeah, well, I like to talk about the fact that really the only thing we can control in our whole world is ourselves, right? Our actions, our reactions, the way that we view things. But you're right, we don't realize it, we forget, we look outward for all the things. And it's just like, no, actually the power is in you. Do you want to speak into that a little bit more, like the kinds of things that you maybe unpack in the book about that control that you do have?
Yeah, and I think it's less about, well, one, it is about your agency, right? But then it's also about that connection that you have to the things that you really enjoy. So the relationships that you have, whether it's something that really lights you up, that delicate dance between doing that. And the problem is in our works, we're often serving others, in our families, instead of coming from this place of I get to do it and real connection and feeling like we're all in this together. It often feels like this lens of servitude, which really can bring people down, even though you compare one person against the other, they're doing the exact same thing. And so what it is about fun is this idea is, are the things that I'm doing, even if they're things that I have to do, am I drawn to them? Are they giving me some sort of pleasure, even if it's like low level pleasure? Or is my whole life designed something that kind of repels me, that if I had the choice, I wouldn't be doing these things? And again, it's not meant to be toxic positivity. Everybody's going to have things that they need to do that they might not want to do. But most people have more control over their circumstance than they do. And once they look at, let's say, 168 hours in their week and start to reclaim even just a few of those, it's like, wait a second, I was able to at least manipulate these things in a way that's not necessarily self-centered or selfish, but in a way that's co-creating these experiences that actually make me enjoy my time rather than so depleted by the end of the day that they find themselves like, oh, wait a second, okay, this is kind of cool, this form of self-experimentation, and it doesn't feel selfish because the next day I'm actually showing up as a better version of myself. And now I do feel connected to something other than doing what is kind of whimsical fun as performative art for someone else. No, this is, even if no one was watching, I would still do this day after day. And so having some form of control in that manner of doing things that you enjoy becomes restorative. And but the thing is, it's a slow burn one way or the other, right? I mean, you start to reclaim some of your time. The concept here is called the hedonic flexibility principle. Once you start to fill that fun cup, it's like recharging your cell phone, right? Instead of depleting yourself all the time, you start to feel good about what you're doing. And then you want to do more of it. And generally, most of us will still want this balanced life, right? It's not necessarily about escapism, because that ultimately becomes a lot less fun if you're just chasing kind of dopamine highs, right? What we're talking about is really feeling connected to the things that you're doing. Once that kind of gets into balance between work and life, what we found is those are the folks that go and look for harder challenges. It's this idea that we're pleasure seeking animals to some degree is true episodically. But the good news is that once we do find the pleasure we're looking for, that's when we have the psychological safety to actually look for areas of growth where we invite challenge in. The problem is that we're all so burnt out that we don't have that energy. And so what we do is we look for poor forms of escapism. In psychology, we call that passive leisure, right? Where we're not really having fun, right? When we plop down on the couch and mindless watch television, and I ask you what you watch the next day, and you're like, I don't know, you kind of trick yourself into thinking you're having fun, because what you're really doing is displacing that discomfort of this painful frustration place that you've been. The geeky word for that's called valence, right? And so we tend to either be in a negative valence state, which is something that we want to get out of, or a positive valence state that we want more of. And so if our whole day has been kind of crappy in this unfun, non-valent state, we just want to get as away from that as possible. But instead of getting into something that's actually enjoyable, oftentimes we just try and get away from what was bad. And the problem is when we do that week after week, we really habituate that behavior, then none of our weeks are enjoyable. And that gets you into a pretty crappy place.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking back to when things were really hard in my life, when I had newborns and it was just chaos. I found myself escaping a lot into my phone, right?
Yeah.
I felt like I needed a minute to myself, and I would just scroll aimlessly, but wasn't doing anything productive. It didn't make me a better mom. It didn't make me happier in the moment. But I guess it's that path of least resistance kind of thing, right? It was there, it was easy to access, and therefore that's what I did. And I feel like that's a lot of what people do because it's easy. So how do we make these fun things, these things that we actually enjoy doing, how do we make those easier so that we go to that instead of escaping to social media?
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. A few things to unpack there. I think new motherhood, because there's definitely a gender bias here, is one of the most challenging times, right? I'm a big part of getting to enjoy what you do is having time affluence. And when you're a new parent, you're some of the most time poor folks on the planet. So you need to approach that with a level of grace, because there are going to be at least a few couple months where it's going to be hard to do much. But what I would say, because it's a great place to start this conversation, is what can you do in a premeditated fashion that will at least give you some of that space, right? And so in that particular scenario, like, where is there a mom's group where you can share the burden of that angst, so that you're with people that you care about? That, again, it's not necessarily creating something that's fun, although I think it is. Certainly the dads groups that I've been at, even when we share our pain, we come out of there with big smiles, right? So you figure out, how can you deliberately put things on your schedule that will give you that space, so that you're trading the time that you are on your phone with something that could be potentially restorative. And so even if those first couple of weeks are hard because you're changing your habits and it's hard to get to the location where that group is, almost every time, no matter what it is, whether it's the scenario that we just talked about or it's the musician that gave up piano and those first couple of weeks suck because it's a reminder of where they used to be and where they are now, and it's not the same. Once you start to develop that habit and you can rely on that thing that you have this connection to, those are the moments that then start to pay dividends in that regard. And so the short answer to that question is, what can you deliberately put on your schedule so that you're creating that space? And oftentimes, more times than not, especially when you're coming from a place of time poverty, it's what can I take off my schedule first? If I'm looking at this and I'm in a domestic partnership, can I share that with my partner and say, you know what? I just need 2 hours where I have some time to do this. And in that negotiation, go, look, by giving me this time, I'm going to show up as a better version of myself. It's not because I'm trying to escape anything. It's because I need this space so that I can recharge my batteries and come back, and we can all benefit from social contagion. The problem is that a lot of times when you're not premeditated in that fashion, both sides will start, right? When one side starts to get burnt out, the other one feels that by proxy, and then it really can be something that drags both down. And so in a healthy relationship, generally, you can have that kind of discourse, but if you're not premeditated by it, again, time goes really quickly when you're not when you have no sleep, right? I mean, it's hard to make those types of decisions when you're in it. And unfortunately, you get to a certain level of burnout, and I make it clear that I don't even advocate for some of these low level interventions, because at that point, then you really do need help, right? You get to what we call stage 4, stage 5 burnout, there begins to be biological consequences where, adding a little fun to your schedule isn't going to pull you out of that rut. But if you can be deliberate about, look, there are going to be a few times where I need to do something for myself, then those are those moments that add that level of restoration. But there are also going to be some time periods, right, where that is challenging. Not all of this is easy, unfortunately.
No, and that's part of it. And I think the other thing is even being aware. How do we get to the point where we actually realize that these things that we have decided don't have value? And that leads me to a part of the book that I really loved, where you were talking about your experience in the medical industry. And I have experience with this because both my mom was a nurse and my dad was a doctor, and they ran their own GP practice. So I can relate to what you were talking about in there. But with the one doctor you talked about and her art practice, like that is very much my area, and art is the thing that brings me the most joy, but it's also the thing that I have the most resistance to, because I think it's that value that we learn from society, we learn from people around us, that doing these kinds of art practices, or that something that's joyful, is not important. And so it really is about flipping the script. So my question is, like, how do we really start to flip that script and understand and actually make it happen in our lives, that we actually prioritize it, and that the pile of dishes don't matter, that the big pile of washing, that does not matter.
Yeah. So, one is figuring out how to create it so that it is habituated so that you don't have to feel guilty about what you do. And the tool in the book that I suggest is story editing, and just unpacking, like, what is the underpinnings that make you feel guilty? Because there's so many people that don't. Figuring out what that is, especially because at the end of the day, something that you enjoy as much as art, if you're engaged in it, really is going to be a benefit, not just to yourself, but to all those around you. And so let's say you, in the worst case scenario, you are using it as a form of escapism, which I know you're not, right? Like 80 hours, then we could unpack that. But oftentimes what I talk about is what we needed to course correct in the 90s, and that was poor sleep hygiene, right? Now we're having very healthy conversations about that. We're also not telling people to sleep 24 hours a day because that would be ridiculous, right? And so figuring out what is the right cadence. Cassie Holmes out of UCLA has done some amazing work in this area. There is kind of a Goldilocks spot. 2 to 5 hours a day should be these types of things that we feel restorative, and no one else should judge you for what you do as long as you're not harming anybody. And so you're right, that societal, pressure, there's a bunch of different reasons why that could be. If you were raised in social normative behavior with regards to this Puritan work ethic, that can be really hard to shake, but you can with practice, because again, doing these things actually allow you to be more productive the next day. So what a paradox, right? Why do I feel guilty about it? This actually allows me not only to work harder, but if I'm in knowledge work, also think nonlinear fashion way more than if I wasn't engaging in a creative endeavor. And then the other is that it's something that transcends the self. It's something that, allows the folks around you to know that you're getting to do what you want to, and it's an invitation for them to do what they want to do too. And then the last piece is getting rid of this old idea that time is money. To some degree, yes, we all trade time for money because that's what vocations are, but there's diminishing returns with that. And so at a certain point, we want to stop doing that. And we do want to enjoy some aspects of life, because if we aren't doing the things that we enjoy, at some point in the timeline of our life, we're going to begin to live with regret. And there's nothing worse than living life with regret.
Mm. I love all that you talk about, and it's just so important to develop that awareness is the first thing. You have to want things to be different. You have to realize that you can have more, that you can have more to your life, that it's all a choice, right?
Yeah, and I think to give more tactical advice, so it's not just is figure out what are those windows. I think folks that do feel guilty because they don't know how much time they should spend engaging in activities that they might feel society feels as frivolous, then just play with what is the time period that makes you worry about that. Is it 1 hour? That should be fairly easy to poke holes in, right? If you can't take 1 hour off the table out of 168 for yourself, then that should be fairly easy to flip on its head and just go, I don't know why this is happening, but I'm going to keep doing that thing until I feel good about it, because of course I should do. I'm spending an hour on my phone kind of in solitude, and I don't feel that guilty about that, or maybe I do, but that active leisure is just so much more restorative than passive leisure. Like, at least make that switch, right? And then start to play with how many hours is it that I can get to which this activity feels healthy, right? And then there's going to be a certain point where it's like, okay, now if I do it longer than this, like if I start to feel like I'm breaking social agreements within my partnership or whatever it is, then that activity actually becomes less enjoyable. And so you wouldn't want to do it that long either. I forget if it was in the book or for Psychology Today, but I talked about a husband that had kind of succumbed to that. He had made some domestic agreements. His wife really wanted to engage in a mind-body practice, and he wanted to golf. And then he took it too far. And so there were periods where he would go off golfing. And one, he was breaking that social commitment. And then two, engaging in the activity actually did come with a level of guilt that was warranted. And so he had to course correct that back. But then, as you know, in the book, I talk about one of my friends, Darren Pougelet, who had given up drums because he had felt some of those same pressures. He wanted to be a great dad, and he felt like he had to give it all away, and quickly realized by giving it all away, he wasn't a great dad because he longed to play the drums. And so he figured out what was the amount of time. He can't be a touring musician anymore, so he did have to make some compromises, but because he's in LA, he's playing amazing gigs all the time. He just played a huge open festival in the beach area of Los Angeles because he figured out a way to integrate that back in. And guess what? His whole family benefited because he's a great guy now because he's doing what he loves. And so I think once you get that taste and once the people around you see it, again, as long as that's why I like the metaphor, as long as you're not sleeping 24 hours a day, you're,
Yeah.
sleeping that 8 hours a day, then you're going to be fine. And again, for folks that like want a hard and fast rule, it seems to be that 2 to 5 hours. Most people aren't going to find 5 hours, but what Dr. Holmes found is folks that do have a lot of time affluence after 5 hours in a given day, unless you're wired outside of kind of the general norm, you'll start to like, maybe I'm spending a little too much time on this hobby. Yeah, that's it. A lot of people get tripped up with the prescription is, meant to just have fun all the time. And I mean, anyone that actually takes the time to read the book knows it's nothing but that. Once you lose that emotional flexibility, that is when the bad things happen. So that's not it. It's that we have access to this, and so many of us aren't doing it because we're waiting around or we're
Mm.
in this constant state of rumination about how can I improve my circumstance rather than taking the little steps to actually do it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is like, because I speak specifically to moms, um, but the ripple effect that you've talked about. So if you're not prioritizing your own joy, that ripples through your family. And when you are and you're in a better place, you will see it. It affects your relationships everywhere. And that's why it's so important. I don't even know how to emphasize it more.
Well, and it takes practice, right? I mean, we both, I think, done a fairly good job in our conversation to acknowledge that. But some folks will try it for a day and they're like, that didn't work, right? I mean,
Mm,
social media is a blessing and a curse, right? Because
mm,
I'm somebody that loves comedy, and at the same time, I think if you overconsume something like Scary Mom, that's always kind of showing motherhood in the pejorative, like that can start to make you go, oh yeah, this is just awful, right?
mm,
And I think when you set that tone, like that everything that's happening is just not going the way that I wish it could, then it continues to do that. So in the book, I talked about how my wife and I, like our morning routine was like that, like the typical, our son always seemed to lose his shoes, even if we put him right by the stairs, right? And everything was just always a pressure cooker. And we realized that's because we had set the tone. I mean, we started the morning with yelling and
mm,
we were like, come on, guys, we just need to get out the door. And so it took time because that was our modus operandi. It wasn't like it happened overnight, but we just made it lighter. Like, okay, guys, this stuff needs to get done. But we had playful music in the background and we made jokes and we still barked commands, but they weren't like drill sergeants. They were through a lens of love and
mm,
parental guidance. And so we didn't really change the objective outcome. We're still late to
mm.
school sometimes, but we don't have that. Okay, now the whole rest of my day, when I have those first couple of meetings, is going to be like, this morning, instead it's like, yeah, you know what I mean? And so
Yeah,
all I'm doing is reiterating what you said. And
yeah.
all that was a mindset shift, right? And
Mm,
so I get it. As something as horrible as my brother dying, I'm not going to reframe that as like, well, he lived a good life. Like, that's a horrible thing. No one's asking
mm,
you to do that. But habitual behavior, things that are habituated life circumstance where we're not going to be able to change the outcome, we generally can at least approach that lighter if it's not killing us slowly, if that makes sense.
The next piece I want to ask about is I find a lot of people are like, well, I'll do it when
Right.
I'll do it, when I have more money. I'll do it when the kids are older, when whatever. So my question, so why do we need to shift the script on that and prioritize it now rather than when we think the circumstances are going to be better?
So do you want the health answer or the like kind of philosophical answer or both? So I'll give you both. I mean,
Yeah, go for both.
the health answer is that we need to create a tapestry of memories, right? The reason that most adults feel like life is passing them by is because the way that we experience time, if we're going through the motions, our brain stores memories the same way we would store, let's say, magazines in a library, right? If we have 100 copies of the same magazine, are we going to keep all 100 on the shelf, or are we going to throw 99 away and have this memory like, oh, at one point I had 100 magazines? That's the same way the brain stores memories, right? You don't remember every single day you drove yourself to work. You remember that I did that for 2 years. But if you start driving crazy ways every single day, you might not remember all of them, but you're going to remember some of them, right?
Mm.
And so the same happens with novelty. As we start to integrate things that are outside of the norm or flex our creativity or expose ourselves to new experiences or new ideologies, those things get encoded into our brain. And so when we look back at the timeline of our life, we have all of these kind of moments, right? And so when you bring those together, it looks like a much longer timeline than the person that kind of just lived day after day and it's like, well, I did this thing. It's essentially just one stop on the timeline of life, right? And so those neural pathways we know help us later in life with regards to cognitive decline. We don't know exactly why, but this science isn't conjecture, it's really sound. All of those different neural pathways can be used as scaffolding as things start to crumble naturally with age. With regards to the philosophical standpoint, we just know that we feel better. When we index new memories, have this tapestry of life because we've experienced things, that's what gives us that resilience. One, because we know that in any given moment, fun can be just a few days away, right? If you have a crappy week, if you reclaim fun in your life, you're like, yeah, I know Monday through Friday is going to be awful because I have this huge project and I just need to get it done. But that date that I have with my husband, because we have a sitter, I'll just put my mind there and I can get through the week. And I mean, it's as simple as that. But so many of us don't do that, right? Again, we've habituated our lives so much that we don't have that integrated. And so, whatever those micro joys look for you, you had already given a nod that I've worked with physicians. For some of them, the only thing that they can control is their lunch hour, but they make sure that they use that 1 hour. In fact, this isn't in the book. I got it when I was giving a keynote for a group of volunteers. This one person had indicated she was in the sandwich generation, like so many of us, right? She had aging parents and young children. She was amongst some of the most time poor. And she's like, so we can't take holidays. We just don't have the financial means, and I certainly don't have the time, but I can always take a whole hour. And I loved that, even that's kind of a play on words. She made sure that she had coffee dates with friends or a walk in the park. And so, even though that seems trite, those moments are the things that we can grab onto and remind ourselves, okay, life isn't necessarily just passing me by. I do have some control to make sure that I'm reminded that even though times might be tough right now, I can create these little micro joys throughout my week that gives me something to look forward to.
Yeah, with those, that's what makes life worth living, right? Is you don't want to just be slogging it all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll wrap things up, but first I want to ask you, you would get a lot of questions, you would talk a lot about fun, obviously, with your book, but what's your least favorite question? Like the one that always annoys you when you get asked.
Now, in a moment, Mike is going to share with us one of the biggest, I'm going to say, excuses for why people can't establish a fun habit. But first, your relationship to fun doesn't have to be challenging. It doesn't have to be racked with guilt. If you're ready to bring the fun back into your life and relationships and ready to be the leader of your own life, I invite you to download my free guide, The 5 Keys to Relationship Revival. Now, you might be wondering what fun has to do with your relationships. But you see, the first key is all about your relationship with yourself. And finding your fun again is a big part of that. Because let's be honest, finding fun in your life can be a real mission if you've forgotten what that looks like. When you've forgotten what it means to have fun. So learn to find your fun again with someone who's been through it too, with someone who's gone from being depressed and crying every day to laughing, dancing, and embracing playfulness on the daily. Having tools for fun in your back pocket will help you navigate the most challenging times in any relationship. So if you're ready to take action to revive your relationships and find your fun again without the guilt, I invite you to download my free guide at www.kirihoney.com/5 habits freebie. That's www.kirihoney.com /5 habits freebie. Okay, so we were talking to Mike and I asked him what his least favorite question was to be asked around fun and the fun habit. I found his response a little surprising. So let's have a listen now to what that was.
That's I don't know. I really like exploring these topics. I think the thing that is the most challenging, so I don't know if it's like the least favorite,
Mm,
is the assertion that this comes from a place of privilege. So certainly there's been some really interesting work, right? And again, going back to where some of what positive psychology got right and what got wrong. So it used to be this idea that after $150,000 a year, money couldn't buy any further happiness, right? There was no utility for making more money. And now I'm kind of geeking out on inside baseball. Cotterman, that had done some of these studies, was challenged by a gentleman by the name of Matthew Killingsworth, who's like, I'm pretty sure money always buys a little bit more happiness. Like we can't make that assertion. And so, sure enough, money is a tool, right? And so, yielded perhaps to buy back more time or whatever. The idea that it isn't helpful, I mean, that would just be a lie to say,
mm,
right? But there are so many people getting it right that don't make much money at all. And
mm,
so I think that's where immediately you look at one example and go, well, that's great for them, but I could never do that. You can't call a friend and make a communal meal together. You can't get a neighborhood barbecue together. You can't enjoy an act of service for some association that you like. So, not even necessarily charity, but you can't get yourself into a conference, some sort of information that really lights you up by volunteering to help out that conference. If you get creative, there's so many pathways to fun that are available to you. But when someone shuts it down because, I did okay as an entrepreneur and do have a little bit of money, it's like, well, that's good for him, but I can't do it. I get it. I'm empathetic to it, but I do feel like, okay, that's you saying you don't want to do the work.
I love that. It's really good. My final question for you is what's the best piece of advice you ever received?
That I ever received. Oh man, there's some good ones.
You can share a couple if you want to.
Well, so my mentor, Michael Gervais, he's a mindfulness coach, and I got really lucky. He's a psychologist that's made a name for himself now because he was the psychologist for the Seattle Seahawks. He has a podcast that's well listened to called Finding Mastery. But I think this idea that we're not our thoughts, I mean, so much of what we believe is reality is really this fabric work of untethered thoughts. And so the ability to pull back and be the observer and realize that a lot of what we believe to be true generally isn't, because it was either force fed to us by someone else, or because if you have a proclivity to catastrophizing like I do, you can build a subjective reality that if you peel it back, it's just not there. And so his advice to me to kind of sit with things and allow them to be, even if they're scary, and really assess them as an observer, are they true, has been so helpful, because then all of a sudden you're like, whoa, wait a second. A lot of this, maybe again, as shared subjective reality, is important to understand, but isn't necessarily true. Because once you get to that place, then a lot of what you and I have talked about the last hour, you can start to challenge, right? Like,
Mm,
why do I feel guilty? Why is meritocracy so powerful with regards to a guiding principle for how I've been living my life up until this point? Are there ways around that? And you can start to play with contrarian ideas, and maybe you won't believe them at first, but you do understand that a lot of subjective reality is a lot more malleable than you believe. And so that one was, kind of blew me away. I paired that advice with reading an amazing book, Sapiens. Are you familiar with it?
nope, I'm not.
So in that book, it essentially walks through, and I know this is super geeky, but it walks through how, even though there likely is something that connects us all, dogma was created by people, money was created by people,
Mm,
government was created by people. And so once you realize all of these sort of structures are human ideas through creativity and we all operate in it, then you can start to pull back a little bit and start to enjoy things, like approach things a little bit more game like. Okay, this is the rules that I need to play with, but I might have a little bit more control over those rules than I initially thought. Again, through the lens of ethically being kind to
Mm.
people, and obviously not doing harm. But
Yeah, that leads. Sorry, I have one more
uh,
question. I thought I said
yeah,
that was the
please,
last question, but I have
that's
one more
fine.
question. You are doing 91 Fun right now. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that and why you're doing that? Or and what
Yeah,
you've
thanks.
noticed from doing
No, I appreciate that, and thanks for being a supporter online. I sort of feel like, yeah, people keep checking in, and so apparently there are a few folks following along. But I've appreciated. I think you and my wife are the only ones who kind of raise their hands, so I've appreciated the support. But it was really to poke fun at 75 hard, and so for folks that aren't aware of what that is, it's this really regimented form of self improvement. And in my work, what I found is there are folks that where that might be helpful, right? If you have an immense amount of available time and a big reserve of grit, I mean, great, those things can be fun. I mean, I used to do Ironmans for some silly reason, right? I mean, there'll be periods in your life if you have that luxury that you should push yourself. But there is so much data to suggest that healthy habits stick around a lot more if you actually enjoy them. And
it.
so this was my way of proving that to be true. And it certainly has. I mean, if you're doing things that you are lured to doing, then they're not work, right? And
Mm,
so I know it's a cliche to say if you enjoy what you're doing, you don't work a day in your life, but there's so much truth to that.
hmm
And yet, again, it's kind of an amazing way to wrap up, right? Because so many of us know that to be true, and yet we put ourselves in circumstances where we're like, I don't want to be doing this, but I quote unquote have to.
mm,
And so to the extent that you can reframe even things that you should do into the mindset of I get to do these things instead of I have to do them, that subtle shift, again, we're not changing the things that we need to do, but that shift of these things I need to do, I get to do them in a way that's enjoyable rather than I have to do them because I just need to get them off my list, and make life a lot more fun.
yeah, I love that. That actually reminds me. Yesterday, I was doing a bit of cleaning, put some music on, made it way more fun.
And it's that simple, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
funny. Anyone that wants to understand that concept, either Google activity bundling or habit bundling or temptation bundling, it goes by a few different names, but it is that simple. And yet, so many folks will
Mm,
forget to turn
mhm.
on music, especially if you have Alexa, right? Just play my favorite music. And so, something as dreary as domestic work, where that whole hour would be about as fun as watching paint dry, can now be enjoyable. And especially the one thing that I love where in private company, I was surprised to find out a majority of folks like dancing by yourself. That's a good kind of example of what you and I were discussing. I don't think I'd admit to most people that I dance by myself, and most people wouldn't, right? Because there's this weird sort of, but it is really fun and you get into flow, and the next thing you know, your house is clean. Like it's that simple, as goofy as it is, right?
I know. I love that. All right. Thank you so much, Mike, for this awesome
Of course.
conversation. Can you just remind us one last time where people can find you?
Sure. Again, everything that I write about, there are links to all trade media at michaelrucker.com. And the book is called The Fun Habit. I was pleasantly surprised to find out the hardback just sold out, but it's still available in mass market paperback.
Nice. Congratulations for that. And
Thank
thank
you.
you again for joining us today. May your coffee be hot, your family be happy, and your relationships be fulfilling and